Millions of frontline workers keep our economy running and are provided with the latest technology to do their jobs. But digital adoption, especially by frontline workers, is really hard.
This is Frontline Innovators. We explore how to overcome challenges and achieve success when we empower our essential workers.
I'm Justin Lake.
And I'm Eugene Signorini. Together, we speak with experts who are leading the way and driving digital transformation to the front line.
This podcast is sponsored by Skillful, on a mission to help frontline workers learn and use the technology needed to succeed in their jobs.
I'm your host, Eugene Signorini, and I'm excited for today's episode. Today's guest is a Prosci certified change practitioner who has had the privilege and experience of working both for and with some of Australia's most iconic brands. She is Microsoft certified in Power Platform Fundamentals and currently works as a global black belt modern work specialist in Microsoft's Frontline Worker Group. Please welcome to the program, Sally Fahey. Sally, really happy to have you with us today.
Hey, June, glad to be with you today.
Great. So, I know you've probably listened to our show before, and I think, we like to kind of lead off with kind of a big overarching question. And that is, what do you see as the biggest challenge facing the deskless workforce today?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a big one to start with. I think it's as simple as being understood. So it's having people understand the work that they do, the environment that they do it in, the tools and processes they need to do their work today, but also how their role fits in the broader ecosystem of an organization, because these are the people that are making the products for a customer, they're transporting them, they're serving their customers. They're a really incredibly important group of people. But I think it's important to also remember that first and foremost, they are people, and they need to be understood as, I think, multifaceted. There's a number of elements to this, but it really starts with how do you best communicate with these people? What are their actual communication needs? We know that there are considerable challenges with things like language and literacy. And then there's hidden and situational disabilities that come into play as well. So maybe someone's dyslexic, or they work in a particularly noisy environment, so they can't actually hear when they're at work, or for big chunks of the time that they're at work. So these things can really sort of complicate and add complexity to how you actually engage and communicate with them. And I think one of the things that the pandemic has really exposed, we've seen this huge focus on frontline workers since the pandemic. But one of the things that I think has been particularly sort of exposed and amplified during this time is just how heavily so many organizations have relied on cascading information through chains of command. And so it's very much a verbal, written, one-way style communication, which I think we've long acknowledged that verbal cascading of information isn't terribly effective. Messages have the ability to be massaged, or perhaps slightly, just a slight twist to what the initial or original message was intended to be. Not intentionally, just by the retelling of stories. If I tell you a story and you tell someone else a story, it changes slightly. So I think, given that that's been disrupted, I think it's actually highlighted, some of those real challenges, and the fact that it's been very much a one-way communication, and how can you really understand these people, what they need, and what's actually going to improve the way they do things if you can't communicate with them effectively. And I think the other thing that comes into play when we think about them being understood is, especially when you go to change something, that the magnitude of a frontline workforce can greatly amplify, the change challenge, in that, if you're looking at the ratios, and they vary between industry. If you take something like retail, you might have 10,000 people working in the corporate function. You might have 100,000 or 120,000 people actually working out in the stores and distribution environment. So that magnitude becomes, greatly amplified as well when you start to go and change something, on top of, do you actually have an effective communication channel open to these people? So I think that understanding of their environment becomes really, really important, and how do we try and engage there?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I love how you kind of bring it back to, to me, it's all about that empathy for the worker, right? And I think you got to the heart of that with understanding them. My co-host for the podcast, Justin Lake, the Skillful CEO, it was funny, before the pandemic, he had written an article, and coined term with this term, the invisible workforce, right? Which is the frontline workers are often the invisible workforce. They're around us constantly. They're the people who are stocking shelves, making deliveries that we tend not to recognize are there. But as you said, this vast workforce that unfortunately went unnoticed for a long time. Now, I do think, as you said, I think the pandemic changed that quite a bit, right? Because I think we all realized the impacts to things like the supply chain and everything else. Well, it impacted those individuals, and the impact to those individuals then impacted everyone. So I think it's, your point about the amplification certainly, kind of resonates, I think now especially. And how do you think the pandemic has kind of changed things from a frontline worker perspective?
I think there's some really noticeable changes, in certain industries, healthcare, for example, there's been such a threat to the person as well. And I think we see this in some of the essential retail, even people working in grocery stores and supermarkets, they're exposed, they're out in public, people won't wear masks and those sorts of things. So they can actually feel like an actual threat to their person by actually just going to work. And then there's all those sort of concerns about, well, am I taking this home to my family? So in certain industries, I think that threat or that sort of pandemic experience has been one to, a threat to personal well-being. There are other industries where again, depending on where you are in the world, perhaps your industry's been closed down. So you might actually have been furloughed. So there's obviously heightened anxiety about, when can you go back to work? Can you go to work? Do you need to get a different job? Like, what are your options? You've still got to, maintain life with, all the things that come with, unfortunately, being an adult and having to pay bills and those sorts of things. So there's, I think for many people working in frontline roles, there's been all this sort of additional pressure, either because you're in an environment where you feel that you are actually at risk, or you are actually not able to work. And that in itself comes with a whole lot of concerns for what's your next option and where do you go from here. So I think it's really sort of highlighted for many organizations that the well-being of the employee is super important. And certainly we do a lot where we look at the knowledge workers, and there's lots of challenges about being on lots of different video calls all day, and the fatigue that we all feel, and having to try and work at home, balance life and those sorts of things. But you're in a nice safe little bubble. Like you can work from home. Most information workers have been able to maintain that. Many frontline workers are either in the direct line of the public, which is a personal threat, or they actually can't go to work, which means potentially they're not getting paid. So I think there's some real challenges there. Again, a lot for the actual well-being of the person that we need to consider about how it's impacting them.
Yeah, I think it's very important to recognize that these workers just don't have that luxury. The luxury many of us do, and the irony, of course, is that we tend not to have the communications infrastructure, the technology infrastructure in place in many ways to serve them as we do serve the knowledge workers. I mean, I loved how you kind of talked about the game of telephone that I think about it, right? When we're trying to kind of communicate with our frontline, right? Too often it's done in an ad hoc manner. Too often we don't really have a great mechanism to communicate, to reach our frontline workers where they are. And I think that, to me is one of those things that I think a lot of organizations are now recognizing is, okay, maybe we've overlooked this for too long.
Very much so. And I think what certainly what we're seeing here in Australia and New Zealand, it's sort of the area that I focus on, is we're also both two countries where we've had to or we've been able to close our borders, and that's had implications for workforce because we do rely on a lot of migrant workers, and with international borders essentially closed for nearly 18 months now, that's actually having an impact on the workforce as well. And we're seeing a lot of movement, from either industries that have been closed, they're now trying to open, but they've had to furlough people. They've gone off and found other things to employ themselves with. There's lots of, I think, disruption in those frontline roles that we're going to sort of feel for quite some time, I think, as we go, as we continue to come out the other side of the pandemic, if we're coming out the other side.
Yeah. And, so I mentioned in your introduction, you've worked with Australian, some of the most prestigious Australian brands. Obviously, I think most people can tell by your accent that you are, not an American, and you've kind of referenced where you are. So I'd love to talk a little bit about you, understand a little bit about your background. I think everyone knows Microsoft, so we probably don't have to explain who Microsoft is, but I certainly would love to kind of hear a little bit more about what you're doing, what your role is, and the Frontline Worker Group, because obviously it seems like a much bigger focus for Microsoft these days. But I want to start with your title, Global Black Belt, because it sounds like a pretty badass title. So what does that mean in the world of Microsoft?
Oh, look, it gives me some great conversation starters with people when they're like, exactly what do you do? They sort of expect a little bit of kung fu or something, which that's not me. But our global black belt role is a specialist function. And we are, if you like, a halfway between our field roles and our product and commercial teams. So in my particular case, we look at I look at frontline workers and really focus on their unique needs and use cases, the challenges that they have. And what we do with our field teams is help them understand what those challenges are so they can engage with their customers. But at the same time, it's a very important listening mechanism. What are we seeing? What are we hearing? In terms of the way that we're developing our products and services, are they meeting our customer needs, or are there things that we need to build into the roadmap? For example, capability, features. We get a lot of, it'd be great if it would do this. That's a brilliant idea, particularly when we start to hear the same things over and over. So this role is one that we talk about incubating new services. And you're right, Microsoft have got a really big focus on frontline workers. The Microsoft mission is to empower every person, organization on the planet to achieve more. That every person part is really important. I think we've long serviced the knowledge worker. We're pretty familiar about what are the challenges. We spend a lot of time researching, collaboration and teamwork and how does that work within the confines of an office and even, across geographies and those types of environments. But if we're really going to empower everybody, we need to be thinking about all those frontline workers. There are billions of them on the planet. So how are we, helping our organizations include everybody? Because so many customers, organizations, they talk about digital transformation, but if they're not including everyone, which is the people on their front lines, are they truly, achieving their transformational aspirations by, leaving potentially the biggest part of their workforce behind?
Yeah. And, it's interesting. You kind of, you made mention, I think everybody thinks about Microsoft and certainly the knowledge worker. And, that's been traditionally the sweet spot, right? And I imagine it's a challenge for the organization to kind of say, okay, how do we address this entirely new segment that is an extraordinary large segment that you talked about? Is that the role of the frontline worker team, essentially, to kind of say, okay, we've got to think differently about this segment?
Yeah, very much. And I think one of the things that I certainly observe with the organizations that I engage with is it's a challenge for our customers as well. So they are sitting here thinking, really common to see different parts of an organization try and tackle a problem from their perspective where the audience is going to be the same. And, there's lots and lots of point and niche solutions out there. If you're thinking about, how do I do time management, scheduling and rostering, great stack of tools that are out there. If you're thinking about how do you do workflow, work process type stuff, again, lots of tools out there that you can choose from. How do you even just do baseline communication so that you can talk to them and they can talk to each other? Lots of shadow IT happening there and all the risks that go with that. So I think what we're doing collectively, the customers that we're dealing with are trying to sort this problem out, because if you've got, what we commonly see is if you've got like 10, 15, 20 different applications by the time you throw in the line of business apps that they need to use, that can become an incredibly fragmented experience, which, coming from a change practitioner perspective, that's a real issue. Where do I go for this? How do I do that? That experience can be really, really broken because it doesn't, the things don't talk together. And so what we see with organizations is if they're trying to solve niche little parts of a problem, maybe it's the operations team want to change something versus the way the comms and people engagement are sort of coming at that problem. So from a Microsoft perspective, we're really helping aggregate what are all those different use cases, and how can you do it in a way that you can actually deliver an experience to the employee that is intuitive and customized to what they need based on what their role is. It's not uncommon for one organization to have multiple different frontline personas. And I'm not just talking about, frontline worker and frontline manager. You might have an organization that produces something. So you've got people in manufacturing and the layers of, hierarchy in manufacturing. They distribute that product. You've got a logistics team going on and a retail presence. So you've got lots and lots of different frontline personas within the one organization. They don't all need the same tools and services. There's some that are common. So how do you build an experience around those common elements, but allow the customization as well? And I think that's where, we're doing some great stuff to really try and bring that together, both for customers to understand, but ultimately so that frontline worker has an actual cohesive experience that makes sense for their role.
Yeah, no, I think that's another thing that I've seen over the years, right? Is that, number one, as you said, a worker may have, 2, 3, 5, maybe even more applications, but even those individual applications, they're very highly transactional in nature in many ways. And so, but they haven't really been designed to help facilitate the user themselves, right? They haven't been designed with that experience in mind, right? It seems like that's one of the areas that Frontline has been left behind, right? We talk about, the devices that we use and the applications we use. There is a tremendous focus on the user experience, but there hasn't really been that focus on the user experience for Frontline. It's almost been like, here you go, this is what you're using, right? And by the way, we may not change it for the next 10 years.
Yeah. I think that the other part of it too, that, I think we're sort of starting to see as well, because it is relatively new for many organizations to really start to kind of focus. I think lots have always had lots of technology out there, but it's always been, again, quite fragmented, quite niche point style solutions. That the other challenge that can come up too is, how do you keep everyone under the same umbrella? And so, we've certainly worked with organizations where they've made a decision for, their people working out in their frontline roles, that's actually then created an even bigger silo and put them on a different island to their knowledge workers. And, knowledge workers need to be able to communicate and share content and requests for tasks and activities, and they get feedback from things that are happening at the front line. If you essentially build two different islands for them, you've then got to try and bridge. And so some of these things that, as we work with organizations and they're like, oh, hang on, you really start to see how it all comes together. And it really is one big ecosystem. You can't think about your frontline as an extension. And I think the community in an organization that we deal with the most, that I think gets this, is, they come by different titles in different organizations, but essentially it's the people and culture, internal communications, corporate affairs group, the people that are often the custodian of culture, because they really want to be able to engage everybody. So literally from, if it's the top floor to the shop floor, to get everybody across. And they're often the ones with the biggest set of challenges about how can we engage. They truly want two-way communication with people. And I think a lot of it starts there, and they're like, well, and very commonly they'll go, well, we're going to use this tool. And someone else is like, oh, well, we'll use this one. And then you've got this fragmentation starting again.
Yeah. And it is a difficult hurdle for a lot of companies because, again, I think a lot of things that maybe they've put in place have been primarily designed for that knowledge worker group. And they say, oh, it would be great to use this, right? But, so take something, I think you talked about like culture or even HR, right? Which is, okay, maybe we've got a learning experience platform or learning management platform, right? But that has been designed, right? At least the delivery of that content has been designed, and that communication is designed for that knowledge worker, right? So now you've got to say, okay, yes, we may want to leverage the same systems. We want to make all this information accessible to all of our workers, but we also have to think, as you said, Sally, which was, how do we think about the experience, how they need to consume that information, get that information differently? And I imagine that's a challenge that everybody is struggling with now.
Very much so. And it again is, I like to think of things as onions, so many layers to it, communications, many layers, but even just access, is it, again, depending on what the tool is, does that have sensitive customer information? Should they only be able to access it when they're actually at a work site? Don't they use their personal device? So there's some things that it absolutely makes sense for them to be able to access through a personal device like their schedule, and to be able to message, their colleagues, hey, I need to swap a shift, or can you pick this up, or, that sort of communication that needs to happen versus, is it an official work thing and therefore I must have a work provided device? And, there's lots of different layers about how complex it is when people start to think about, okay, we're going to enable our frontline. Even thinking from a change perspective, what's the most logical first case to start with? Because again, if you just threw all the capability out there at once, any change practitioner will tell you, don't overwhelm everybody all at once. So again, what's that logical order? Where's that sort of two-way give-get? What's in it for the actual frontline to get them to do something different versus what's the actual return to the business of starting with this particular use case? So it's a fun space to be in, because there's lots of different complexities when you start to think about it programmatically. How do you deliver these services, right down to what's the way that they're going to be able to, connect? And this is where we see a lot of different anxieties or challenges for different parts of the business. And very often it's almost like a two-speed. Anyone that's in the sort of technology teams will can potentially be going, well, hang on, slow down, security and compliance, and different parts of the business are like, well, we've got a business objective, we just have to get this done. Particularly pandemic, communicate, we've just got to throw something out there so we can do it, because we've lost our verbal chain of relaying information. And the lens that different parts of the business will look at this from a different as well. If you're thinking operations, they'll be looking at, hey, we're going to be able to reduce labor costs, or there's going to be, improvements for our people's well-being because we're going to be able to, deliver better content. From technologists, they could be sitting here going, well, hang on, if we're going to put another 20,000 people in here, what about password resets and, protecting our information? And again, it's a very different lens and conversation to have.
Yeah. And what we found is it's very interesting. I mean, because it raises that question, like, okay, well, how do we don't even have these people on email, right? So we've seen, a ton of, that they don't have an ability, they don't have single sign-on capabilities. They don't have email, they may have devices, but in many cases, they're not personal devices, right? They're shared devices. So it raises all those questions, right? And so, like you said, I think there are a lot of potential bottlenecks that are preventing organizations from effectively doing this, even as much as they want to, right? So I think you're raising some really, really good points. So I want to talk a little bit about your homeland a little bit and where you are, because I know a lot of people, they obviously know Australia, but to a lot of people, it's just this big place. So where are you in Australia?
Right now, I'm in Tasmania, which if you look at a good map, it will be the little island at the bottom. It's one of our bugbears that sometimes Tasmania is left off the map of Australia, but it's the little island state at the bottom. You might have heard of a Tasmanian devil.
Of course, yes.
Tasmanian devils, but they don't look like the Warner Brothers Tasmanian devil at all. But they do make a similar sort of noise. So that's where I am right now.
And is that where you're originally from as well?
I am. So I am taking advantage of being what I call myself a COVID refugee. I am normally based in Melbourne for work, but Melbourne also has the dubious honour of being the world's most locked down city. So I was quite fortunate to get out at one point before we locked down again, and have been able to relocate to my home state for an extended period. I will be going back to Melbourne. Our office has opened again, so we'll be going back after Christmas. But it's been great to be able to be in a different place.
That's great. That's great. So tell me a little bit about your path. One of the things I like to ask some of our guests is, what was your path to innovation, to where you are? So how did Sally get into, kind of this interest? And obviously you're passionate about it, about kind of the frontline worker in this space.
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of things. Like even if I think back to when I was at uni, I did a technical degree, but found I was a lot better at what technology could do for you versus coding. And I had a really good learning during my honours year, which is that technology for technology's sake isn't necessarily a good thing. And I did my thesis I was looking at was showing my age back in the early days of online payment systems. And I compared two different customers. One was selling fishing lures, which are non-perishable, very small, and able to be posted, and there's a global audience for them. And the other was trying to sell chocolate mud cakes, which is perishable and doesn't transport very easily. And it was really interesting because they're both using the same platform. And one was like, this is brilliant. And I was like, oh, that's not really working for me. And again, it's like, is it the technology or what you're trying to do with it? And interesting because I've ended up in Frontline, but at the time, and from school and even when I was at uni and probably for the first couple of years when I had a real job, I worked at McDonald's. So I think I spent probably 7 years working at McDonald's. Started as crew trainer, manager, shift scheduler, all the things in the role that I do today that just makes so much sense about, the pain and frustration around particularly the operational inefficiencies of scheduling, having been someone who scheduled for a couple of years there. But in between uni and now, I worked for a large telco company. I spent a lot of time actually in account management and sales management, and really enjoyed the aspect of how technology could help organizations. And I found that I was getting a little away from the solutioning part, being in sales management, studied, did a master's and focused on complex project management because I wanted to get back to the people aspect. And that's where I found people change management. So I took a bit of a career change, went and worked for an organization for a few years between that one and Microsoft, where we were doing a lot of business process transformation. So it was consolidating finance and HR and payroll from what had been 20 separate businesses as they were coming together from one. So really great to actually go work in a customer because I've often worked for vendors, really get an understanding about how do all those different functions work? How do they come together, especially as you're trying to consolidate? And then I found my way into Microsoft and was lucky to work in what we had a customer success unit, which is, again, all about how do you help people with technology and what can technology do to help your organization. So I've always believed that technology is an enabler, but technology for technology's sake isn't the answer either. So it's what's the right solution for the particular circumstances, and everyone's circumstances is going to be different. So I think I'm a natural problem solver, and I like to understand things, and I like to help people. And so I think my way into this role coming from a strong kind of change, understanding use cases, what works, what doesn't, and again, just that really desire to how can we actually make a difference, and where does technology have a play in that role?
Yeah, that's great, Sally. And obviously you've lived it, personally being, having kind of been on the front line for a bit, and certainly sounds that you have this passion to really kind of understand the people. And that was kind of the challenge that you kind of highlighted early on in our conversation here, which was, that they just want to be understood. So talk to me a little bit. I mean, how do you do that, right? Or how do you help your customers do that? What's some advice that you have to kind of say, hey, here's how you really understand what's happening on your front line?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in seeing is believing. And I recently worked with a large organization, and one of the challenges that they were having was actually getting their executives to understand what was happening in their retail environment, their stores, and a particular aspect of something, and literally how much time it was taking. It was one of my pet hobbies, which is scheduling. Again, the scars of my McDonald's days coming through. And so we actually did some videoing and showed them, like, how do you think this works when someone needs to swap a shift or calls in late at the last minute? And, by being able to show with, a video, and they were just like, oh, really? Or like, yeah, this is a massive overhead, but it's a hidden cost. And so I think sometimes it's about exposing what are those sort of hidden costs to the business that are actually just really painful for the people that work in the business as well. Some of the things that we sometimes just accept and take for granted. So I think there's that understanding really comes from just asking lots of questions. If you can go and spend a day. One of my favorite jobs I used to do when I was in account management was ride-ons.
Mm-hmm.
I've been on fishing trawlers and through mining processes. And when you actually see it with the person that understands it, you can ask questions. And I'm a firm believer there's no dumb questions. Just if you see something, ask. It's phenomenal, the things you go, what's that for? And they're like, oh, you get a great story. I think, oh, really? Or even just being in the environment and you see things posted on walls, like what's important here? What's going on? How do you actually find out about that? Oh, well, either they'll explain, someone tells us, or I don't know, I don't really pay attention to it. Okay, so you get a feel for how things actually work, if you've got the opportunity to go out and see it and engage with it. But I think asking lots of questions is a really good place, and especially if you've already assumed what you think it looks like if you've done that before or you've been in that situation before? Is it exactly the same? Because again, I can walk into two organizations that, on paper would look like they're the same business, but they're not, because that's where the cultural element comes into play. And that has such a huge bearing on communications. And from a change perspective, communications is just core. So if you can't understand how those bits work, that's really going to help things along the track. So that's that. If you can, go and see it. Go and ask the people what works for you, what doesn't.
Yeah,
You'll be surprised at the answers.
I think that's tremendously important, and and I think it's part of that. What you talked about earlier, which is kind of understanding, because I think a lot of times, technology has been pushed down to the front line, or change, whatever it is. If it's technology, whatever it is, communicate, it just gets pushed down. And, a lot of times these workers don't feel like they're being heard. And from my experience and our experience at Skillful, especially, we try to do a lot of ride-alongs as well, because you find most people on the front line, most people in general, but I think especially employees on the front line, are very willing to talk, right? Very willing, because they feel like, oh, finally, somebody is asking me questions, right? Finally, somebody wants my opinion, right? And is really trying to understand me, as you kind of talked about earlier.
Yeah, I had a really important learning. It was a project I was working on. It's probably 12 months ago now, actually. And I was in my success manager role, and, a team was asking me, can you come and, show some people this stuff? And, we've sort of done it, but they don't seem to kind of get how it works for them. And I was like, okay. So rather than what I call the show up and throw up, I like to go, so, hey, what do you know? What, help me help you. And I got a really strange answer, because like, they were asking some what I thought was really basic stuff. And I'm like, I know someone's shown this. So I was like, okay, so there's something else here. So I was like, help me. Can I understand why is that important? Like, because I'm like, it does that. How do you use it today? And then I got shown this whole system, and I was like, oh, that looks very different. Now, because we've actually taken the time to go and look what you've got, rather than just let me show you what I've got, the things that came out from that were really, really enlightening. And again, so much of it came back to communications. One of the things that really stood out to me was, this was a comms team I was working with, and they had a process where they were trying to communicate, how do you put a spider wire, like a security device, on an electronic toothbrush box? And coming back to the sort of challenges of language and literacy, it was taking them between 11 and 12 pages of photos and text to actually communicate this. And so it was this long text, heavy pictures, video on a phone, 11 or 12 seconds. Everyone's like, oh, I get that. So really sort of stepping into that world and go, this comms, like, yes, you can text and you can do that. What are you trying to do? And you see those things and go, oh, well, actually, there's a whole other set of capability or things that you might want to consider if this is the type of stuff you're trying to do, because I can see why that's not going to work for you. But we hadn't asked that question before. Show me, what do you do today?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it's like, wow, okay, I get it.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to the whole thing is, how do we really tailor that message to the front line? What's the best way to kind of communicate? I also think this is a great transition to something I want to kind of ask you specifically, which is, we hear the term digital transformation. It's widely used, right? Perhaps overused. I don't, depending on your perspective, but, the fact of the matter is, transformation means change. Right. And so if it's not managed effectively, then those digital transformation initiatives are kind of bound to fail. Right. So I'd love to kind of get your perspective, because I know you've worked with so many companies, but what have you seen that has been effective when it comes to change management for digital transformation projects? What have you seen that has maybe led to disaster, failure, however you may want to call it?
Yeah, let's start with the good ones first. I think that the elements of a good transformation, probably some of the things I've been talking about, really communicate, but really understand to begin with what it is that you're actually trying to achieve, and how is it going to come together. So, that's really about involving, who are the people that are going to be impacted, understanding, what's your current state, what's your to be state, what's the delta, and what is that actually going to mean for the people that are going to be impacted by the change, but also getting their feedback, how, if you can, any kind of, proof of concept, prototype, can they kind of touch, feel, see it, play with it a bit, get that feedback. I think that's really important. Great sort of story of an airline that was redesigning their planes. And they actually, they'd done all the, this is how we're going to lay out the galley and then kind of last minute, they were like, oh, we should ask some of the air hostesses, what do they think about this? Oh, bad. I had to go back and redesign the whole thing. And they're like, you should have asked us about this. They had things in like all the wrong spots. And it was just, fortunately they did before they actually commissioned it say, could you tell us what you think? But if they'd involved them in that process a whole lot earlier, they would have saved a lot of time. They would have, the cost associated with redesign, those sorts of things. So I think engaging the people that are going to use the service or solution early on in the process to sort of get their feedback, especially if it's something like that that's going to involve a physical space that people are going to be working in, or a tool that is a tool of trade for them. How do you engage in that process? There's always, I think, an element of how do you engage people. So the classic what's in it for them, particularly if there's any anxiety around, is this going to result in me getting less hours, or does my job go away? If it's, the dreaded automation, what does that mean? So being really, I think, transparent on what it actually does mean. And if it does have impacts on the workforce, be upfront about it and call it out. Because I think we've seen lots of examples where there's either been anxiety, and that has absolutely not been what the outcome has been, but they've lost good people along the way because they've just gone, well, if this is coming, I'll leave anyway. So being transparent about what those sort of impacts are going to be. I think on the other side, the things that haven't been done well is exactly that. Don't communicate well. Leave it up to people to make assumptions about things, and some of them they'll make rash decisions, and they'll think, this is, the fear and anxiety can really play on some people, so they'll make decisions. I'm better to jump than get pushed, for example. I think there's also the opportunity for the key benefits to be lost by trying to be a little subtle about what's coming in. And I think the final one is, if not engaging people in, what's the outcome, what's expected of them, especially if it's something that isn't avoidable, like you will have to do this on this date. Making sure people have got time to do the learning and the training and build that in. I see lots of change programs, particularly with like places like contact centers, for example, people very much on hours. They might only have like 2 hours a month that's there for training. So anything they need to know needs to be really crisp, really concise and actionable, and good resources that are going to help them afterwards. But be mindful of things like language literacy and disability in any kind of written style communications that you're preparing, videos with subtitles or languages, things that can be really sort of powerful communication aids. We start to see I'm going back into the good things, some great examples of using like QR codes to bring up information with videos and things, far more dynamic than the kind of static poster in the tea room. The poster's there, but there's a QR code. You get a video. There's so much more you can convey through video that you can't through sort of written or just words, pictures alone. But the comprehension, all the studies show that your ability to comprehend something that you saw on a video is a lot higher, and your retention far higher than what you read or see as pictures. So, the more you can put into, an effective and open, accessible communication channel, I think there's a lot of positives that come through there.
Yeah, and I think this is something I really want to kind of dig in a little bit more on, because I think you talked about this upfront communications is very critical, involving, getting that feedback, getting that buy-in early on, right? It's not just the feedback, but it's saying, okay, we're getting the buy-in from the team because they're participating in the design of it. And then you talked about this transparency to kind of alleviate kind of anxiety, right? Which I think is something that we've heard a number of times on this podcast, and it's one of these things that often goes overlooked, I think, a lot, which is just, listen, any change raises anxiety, right? I think technology change, especially because is this going to, are they going to be expecting me to produce so much more with this? Are they tracking me, with this technology? Is this technology going to replace me? Am I going to figure out how to use it? And if I don't, am I going to lose my job, right? As a result of it. I think that's really important. And then you were kind of alluding to certain, kind of technologies. And I'd love to kind of dig in on that a little bit, because, one of the things that we talk about, and obviously at Skillful, this is a big focus for us, but it's, okay, if those users can effectively adopt technology or embrace the technology, then the project or the program is bound to to fail, right? Or at least never realize the aim of it to the first place. Have you seen companies kind of adopting technology? Are you promoting technologies to help them in the communication and the adoption during the change management process itself?
Yeah, lots of it. Not surprisingly, a lot of it's in the Microsoft platform.
Yep.
But we certainly see, especially when it comes to engaging with frontline workers. And I'm a bit of an anti-email kind of a person because I don't think it's a particularly effective two-way communication method. But looking at how do you engage and use all those sorts of, I guess it's what I call the communicators toolkit. If you've got a site, if someone wants to proactively go and look at information, you've got still use your verbal cascading if those channels are still available to you, because that's where people are used to consuming or receiving information. So absolutely use those. I think one of the most effective channels for change style communications is actually champions networks, so peers. I think that's one should never underestimate the power of actually receiving a message from someone you work with and you respect, that if they're on board with this, it should be a good thing. So actually getting those champions of change within your business, also fantastic for two-way, because they live and breathe it. What's working, what's not, what's resonating, where are the likely points of resistance going to come from, so you can plan from those before you hit them. Lots of different ways I mentioned before, using things like QR codes and linking to videos. Big advocate for using video for all those sort of challenges around communication, but also just how much you can convey in a 2-minute video or a 1-minute video versus how many pages of text does that look like. But also being very much multi-channel. So how are you getting something out via text, but is that text linking to videos and different things to sort of bring in different mediums as well as the print and the verbal. So, the classic kind of change theory will tell you need to tell someone 5 to 7 times about a change before they actually can take it on board. I tend to be probably the other end of it because I'm also busy. So I appreciate that the people that I'm trying to communicate with, telling them once that's not enough. At least 5 to 7 times. And it's not just me telling you 5 to 7 times. Multimodal. Is it text message? Is it there are visuals somewhere in their workspace? Is someone that they know and respect communicating that to them as a peer, as well as they're hearing it from a manager? So it's all these sort of different channels that you've got available to you, and just make sure that you're hitting all of them and be very deliberate in your communication channel about who communicates what with what frequency through which channel as well.
Yeah. And I think it's that also that, you talk about this, these people are extraordinarily busy, right? They've got, they don't have the flexibility to say, oh yeah, I can spend, a couple hours kind of learning this thing. Right. So it's that repetition, which is very important, but also the ability to provide them those resources. So when they've said, okay, I remember hearing something about that, now I've got to kind of go back and understand. And now I'm in the field and on my own, and I've got to kind of really be able to kind of grasp that when I need. I think that's very important too, right? That ability to support them at kind of the moment of need, if you will.
Very much. And I see an increasing use of things like chatbots, text-based things to, for people to be able to go, hey, what's this? Because, we can't retain everything, particularly as adult learners. I think that's the other thing that I probably should call out is really acknowledge adult learning styles. You sort of hit a certain age and your days of being able to sit in a classroom for a prolonged period of time, consume a whole lot of content and then remember it 2 months later, let alone 2 weeks later, really diminishes with age and the longer you spend in the workforce. Because it's just not how we do things. We don't focus for long periods of time. So that just-in-time access to the learning at the time that you need it. And, chatbots for where's the, they are fantastic as a resource. You can run them 24/7. Get your champions to tell you what are all the things you're hearing. You can pre-populate a lot of that content and just make it really accessible in it can be quite a private way. I'm not really sure, but I've got this chatbot I can ask. Mm-hmm. So even if they've got anxiety, it can be a private way to access that information. They don't have to ask their manager or a peer. It's about making it available. It can also just be practical. Many frontline roles operate 24/7. It's 3:00 on a Saturday morning. The help desk probably isn't there for them, but a chatbot could be. So some of those sorts of technology we really see playing a key role in being able to make information easily accessible again through a mechanism that's quite low cost and effective to be able to have quite a broad reach.
Yeah, you made this very subtle point there that I think is a really important one, right? Which is, hey, I mean, I can talk to this chatbot and there's no judgment, right, from the chatbot, if you will, right? And I feel comfortable with that in some ways. It's one of the things we've seen, right? You talked about adult learning styles and just the classroom environment, for example, which has been used in the past, right? And we've heard from a lot of workers are saying, yeah, I don't like that environment, right? One is, maybe I'm embarrassed to raise my hand, right? And say, I don't really understand what's going on, right? Because I don't want to be, seen among my peers as stupid or, slowing everybody down, whatever that may be. And giving them the tools that they can learn, right? That they can understand things in their own way, right? Because it's not just, you mentioned adult learning styles, which I think is great, but even within that, like everybody has a different style of learning, right? Whether it's visual or more auditory learning styles. So I think it's very important. And I do think technology can help. I mean, we certainly believe it, but that technology can be a powerful tool to kind of ease that anxiety, as you kind of alluded to earlier as well.
Yeah. And I saw a great program I worked with a couple of years ago. It was with an organization that had a large field workforce, and they were kind of faced with a challenge. You talk about digital transformation. Their kind of challenge in this particular aspect was aging workforce, many facing retirement age, aging infrastructure, no documentation. So the people that know about it just know how to fix it because they've been fixing it for 40 years.
Right. It's this institutional knowledge, right? That's in people's heads. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what they did was a really effective program of kind of vox pop videos from the field for the field. And they're unedited. You pull this one out here, you put that over there. This is going to make a funny buzzy noise. That's okay. Ignore that. What's all that stuff that the tech knows? He's not going to sit and write it in a manual. But you know what? The next guy that comes along, he doesn't want to sit and read a manual either. Here's a video of the guy that did it before. Younger generation, very happy to consume content YouTube style. And with the kind of platforms these days, it's really easy to search video libraries and pull up, the model number, blah, blah. Here's the 4 videos. Which one? What are you trying to do to it? Pick your video. Oh, is that how it works? Problem solved. Because in many roles, that trying to access support is also, you might be out by yourself. We think of lots of frontline worker roles in places like hospitals and, supermarkets and things, but there's lots of people working like field service roles that they are by themselves. They can't turn around and ask the person next to them because that's the customer and they don't know.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the biggest anxieties we've heard, which is, listen, if I'm going to be alone, right? At some point, I'm going to be on my own, whether that I'm literally in the middle of nowhere, or I'm down in a basement trying to fix a piece of machinery, or I'm alone in front of a customer. I'm trying to deliver product and I'm alone in front of a customer. I'm not going to have somebody's shoulder to tap on, right? To ask them a question. And if I don't get it right now, I'm going to negatively affect that customer experience. I'm going to be embarrassed. Right. Yep. And I think, and I love this notion that you kind of talked about, which is trying to capture that institutional knowledge. Right. And I think, that generational shift that's happening in that workforce, I think for both sides of it, it's so beneficial, right? Because I think it also can provide a role for, workers who are, maybe trying to wind down, right? To kind of, they're ready for retirement, but maybe this gives them another role, right? Which says, okay, you're going to be kind of our institutional, we want to leverage your knowledge. And maybe you're kind of the expert, if you will, but helping kind of digitize some of this stuff. And then, for that next generation coming aboard, right? They are, they're trying to catch up to 25 years of experience, right? And replace somebody with 25, 30 years of experience. And obviously that can't happen overnight. So I think that's a wonderful example you just gave. So.
Yeah. And it doesn't even have to be super sophisticated. Like I say, they're literally out there with their own mobiles recording the stuff.
No, I mean, the less sophisticated, the better, right? Because the more sophisticated it is, it's just not going to happen. So you have to make it easy, right? To do that.
Yeah. So it makes it really accessible as well.
Yeah. One of the things, Sally, I really like to, like to kind of wrap with a lot on these calls is kind of another two-sided question, which is obviously you've been working in and around technology for quite some time. What is it that you love about working in technology, and what is it that you don't like so much?
I like the possibility. I mentioned before, I like to be able to solve problems. And I think there's, as we solve one lot of problems, you get another lot. The technology gets better. There's always opportunities to do more with it. And I think that there's so much, particularly in the areas of accessibility, that's just opening up new opportunities for both people and organisations. And I think it's a phenomenal enabler. And I think that's the beauty of technology. One of the things that we sort of focus on Microsoft, particularly when we think about frontline workers, is really there's kind of three words that encapsulate it. And I think that it's all there. There's, for frontline workers, it's all about flexibility, knowledge, and purpose. And, I think technology really enables all of those things for people in areas where we haven't traditionally been thinking about that or had the tools and mechanisms to be able to enable those things. So that flexibility, knowledge, and purpose, I think, for me, my love of technology is because it lights up those things. The thing that I don't like about it is anyone who's seen me do live demonstrations is never work with animals, small children, or technology, because sometimes the technology gods aren't kind to you when you want to do something. It's like, come on. So I think it's not perfect, but it's kind of, it's not human either, but it's got some characteristics where it's like, I have good days and bad days too. So I
think that's a great way to wrap it up, actually, because it's like, your frustration is just like many of the frontline worker frustrations, which is like, this technology doesn't work when I need it to work. What's going on? So I think we've all experienced that, for better or for worse. So Sally, I really appreciate you taking the time today. I really appreciate you joining us from the far side of the world in the middle of the night. Thank you very much for that. People, if they want to, if folks listening or audience want to kind of get in touch with you, LinkedIn, Sally Fahey is a great way to do it. We'll put a link to Microsoft's kind of frontline, the frontline group, so they can learn more about that. And again, I really want to thank you for your time, and really, really enjoyed our chat.
Yeah, same here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. All right, let's wrap it up here. I hope you found this conversation as enjoyable as I have. And if so, please share and rate the podcast. 5-star ratings help ensure that it gets promoted to other professionals like you that are innovating on the front lines. And a reminder, this podcast is sponsored by Skillful, the mobile digital adoption platform for deskless and frontline workers. You can visit the Skillful website at skyllful.com. And if you or someone is out there innovating on the front lines, we'd love to hear about it. Please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn and share your story. Until then, see you on our next episode.